core insight, right, of Rebag is this is very true. Historically, actually, there's a lot of good statistics on this. Like if you bought like especially Birkin handbags, a decade ago, like you would have beat the S&P, for instance. Right? It's pretty crazy, and it works largely for some Chanel handbag.
Welcome everybody to Sobremesa podcast. Today we have a special guest, someone very close to the FJ family, Charles Gorra, who's the CEO and founder of Rebag. Rebag is an online fashion retailer focused on secondhand luxury items. Think about designer bags, shoes, jewelry, and it's also a leading brand in the very trendy circular economy. The most important thing to me though, Charles, is you're a Frenchman, so you understand this concept of Sobremesa. You have practice with this food-loving country, long lunch breaks. So I think we're going to have a good time. You have practice with this. So welcome to the show.
Yeah, no, glad to be here. Thanks for inviting me. Appreciate it.
Great. Charles, let's start from the beginning. Looking at your profile, banking, PE, MBA, there's nothing screaming tech, let alone fashion. So walk us through your kind of finance bro background and what made you deviate from that.
Yeah, definitely not bro. Finance, yeah, that's fair. So yeah, I mean, you're absolutely correct. I mean, I'm not from this world. I'm not from fashion. I'm not even from tech initially, right? So I spent the first 6-7 years of my career. That's what people did, right? In 2007. Right, like my first job, or like 2006, was still the grand days of finance, right? So I started IBD, investment bank at Goldman, and that was the thing that you did when you want to stay a generalist, and you think you're smart, and you want to make a few bucks, and you don't really know what you want to do in life.
That's exactly what I did, by the way. 10 years after you. Yeah.
Exactly. So I did that. And then, after a few years, I moved to private equity after that, which, I wanted to get closer to companies and sort of operating. And then after that, I realized even private equity was still very financially driven and not really operating, and say, okay, what do I want to do with my life? And that's where I went to the MBA. And so I went to HBS 2012, right? So, and I think that's where it got started. And I think the luxury of having those 2 years on campus, I mean, I had the luxury of spending those 2 years investing in ideas, meeting people. I mean, I'm sure we're going to talk about how I met Fabrice and FJ Labs. And it's all of that is a process. And to be honest, has some serendipities, like
But you knew you wanted to do that change at that point when you went to the MBA.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you read my essays, they say exactly this. They say, hey, I want to get out of finance. I want to start a company. I want to do and I wanted to start a company in the sort of internet, right, with a big I. So I was pretty spot on those two things, but frankly, that could be a million things. So now how and why and business models and sectors, all of that is largely serendipitous.
Totally. And to your point on generalist, right? Because this jobs, consulting, banking, PE, and a bunch of other generalist jobs the personality behind those is typically people that get easily excited with a bunch of things, generally smart, but it's hard to narrow down into one idea. So when you went to the MBA, to HBS, and said, okay, I want to do something in the internet, just as broad as you can think of, how did you narrow down to, okay, fashion, or how do you go about starting that process to narrow down to one thing?
Yeah, so it sounds silly, right, saying it, but that's literally what I did. I said, but to be honest, even saying I want to do something digital, right, would be the way to think about it. Like that already excludes a bunch of things, because frankly, at the beginning, I even thought, I don't know, I can start a restaurant, I can start a hotel chain, right? So I really thought about entrepreneur with a big E. And then I was convinced that entrepreneurship had to be digital. So that already makes the world a little bit smaller. And then I went really through this like funnel thing, which is a combination of like, what am I interested in / what am I good at? And when you do the intersection of these two things, it starts becoming pretty small, right? Because I realized pretty soon, I'm not a technical person, to your point. So every time I literally went to these meetups, on campus, it's like whatever, healthcare, biotech, hardware, deep tech. I'm like, I don't know any of that stuff. So I think if you have a generalist background, as you say, it's very difficult to go into more like hardcore tech, right? So I thought pretty quickly, I have to go more like the consumer road, or I have to go internet enabled, right? So,
Got
and
it.
that's also like, so that was the thought process. It's like
So you
not
started with
where
process of elimination in a way.
it's exactly that. It's like what can I not do, right? Where because it would be ridiculous, right? If I want to start or whatever, or fix cancer or something, like I don't know anything about it, so it didn't really make much sense. So I thought consumer is something much more approachable, and so that's how I read. But then in consumer, I thought about business models and really themes, right? Or like there's that idea of passion or themes, and so the reality, I didn't have a passion, so that maybe would have made the process a whole lot easier, right? If you say, I don't know, my passion was not luxury.
100%. 100%.
uh,
I when I you know thought about starting a company many times in my life, and I always got very excited about XYZ idea, and I thought it was a tremendous idea, but never executed because, to your point, it wasn't the idea. And to me, in my mind, I had to be extremely passionate about something, so passionate that I had to dedicate 10 years of my life. Maybe what's the saying? Maybe we should adapt the saying of those who can do and those who cannot become venture capitalists. Maybe that's what happened to me. But like, how did you say, okay, now I'm going with this, if you didn't have that passion, which is a prerequisite for a bunch of people to say, okay, I'm spending
yeah.
the rest of my 5 years in this.
Yeah, and I think I got passionate over time. So really what happened is I started investigating a theme. So it actually didn't really start with resale, or it really started with that idea of how technology solves for waste. That was kind of my guiding light. Waste, I really love that idea. Think about it, it's hard to understand now. This was 2012. Like, it was kind of the beginning of Uber, right? Uber is like 2009, right? Or like Airbnb is 2009, 2010. So you're talking these businesses existed, TaskRabbit, right? Like, I was interested in all these businesses that technology helps. There's essentially a fixed asset or some sort of capacity, right? And then you're kind of making, recycling or reusing that idle time or that idle closet, right? Or or your idle car or your idle house. So that was kind of my idea, and then I narrowed it down. And to be honest, I had an internship. Sometimes it's this where there's serendipities in life. The way it happened is the summer between HBS, right? Like you actually have 2 years. And so usually if you want to start a company, you go either work on a project or you take an internship somewhere that makes sense for you. And so I investigated like early stage startup that made sense. And basically I had two offers, and one offer was in that company that was basically an Uber competitor that I think doesn't even exist anymore.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, it was a London based, it was called Halo,
Mm.
Hailo. And these guys they were the pioneers in London in 2010. You could have a Halo on your phone way before Uber. And these guys were setting up in the US. And I thought that would be a huge thing. Well, it turns out I was kind of right in a way because Uber became $100 billion thing, but Halo became zero, right?
But you
So
didn't pick it though, so you made the right call.
So I didn't do it. And then at the same time, I met the founders of Render One Way. And this kind of like sometimes you read things and you're like, I met them. I don't know if you know them, Jen and Jenny. They're sort of visionaries
I
and
know
just
of them, yeah.
it's incredible. And all of it makes sense. There's like, I have a clause. I want to be in the fashion. I want to be in the know of fashion. I want to access product. I don't have an infinite wallet. I don't want to waste the planet, trashing, with fast fashion goods. And I thought that whole idea was intriguing to me, and they were super special. And I pulled down that thread, and then it's more, that's how I got started. And then it's the thread that I pulled.
Understood. Can you maybe explain? Because to me, it wasn't obvious at first when people mention how sustainable secondhand is and how bad for the environment is. Some, not all of them, but some sort of fashion is so bad for the environment. Can you throw a couple of stats at us to paint that
Yep.
picture?
Yeah, no, for sure. Some of the stats, textile, right? Fashion slash textile, second most polluting industry in the world, right? Already there, right? Pretty much, which is crazy, right? So everything, most of what you know, most of what you wear ends up somewhere in a landfill, usually somewhere around Africa or Asia, right? And so it's really, really, there's a lot of reports on this. I'm not, things like Shein, that's now the new H&M, the new Zara. Like you're buying like a $5, t-shirt, a $1 t-shirt. Like, how do you think it's made? How long do you think it's gonna last? Where do you think it ends up, right? So there's obviously a spectrum, but it's definitely a prime. And so obviously on the luxury side of things, you're dealing with much more strong and reliable product over time. But it's a huge problem. And so that's what I liked about it, is not only it solves for a personal need, which is you want to be in the know, you want to be, with great product, you want to be on the trend, but at the same time, you want to be mindful of environment. And I definitely had that idea, again, 10 years ago, that eventually sustainable commerce or sustainable values would become mission critical just because of environmental purposes. And so that was definitely in the vision, if you will, the core trends identified.
Yeah. And it's interesting what you're mentioning. I know many entrepreneurs, without giving any names, that at first were not, hey, this is my life's mission, but they got increasingly more excited the more they dug into it. And so that's what seems to happen to you. And maybe that's a message to other entrepreneurs, that maybe you just don't need to find your life's calling from day one, and it just grows on you, and then it's just a matter of solving problems every day, and eventually it becomes your life's mission, but not maybe from day one.
Yep,
um
completely agree.
Charles, before moving more to the nitty gritty of the business, I want to touch upon your experience as a Frenchman in the US, because you're in New York right now, business in the US, but you didn't have a visa originally, right? Like how is it like to start a company in the US as a foreigner?
Yeah, it's super hard, man. Honestly, we could do a whole other podcast.
Yeah,
Just
yeah.
I like to do this joke that if after Rebag, I can probably start an immigration law firm, because I've learned so much. I am so deep into the tech. There is not one visa that I probably haven't heard about.
All of the
Uh,
letters. Yeah.
Dude, it's so much. So the reality is I've been on 5 different statuses since I'm in the US, right? Can you imagine that? So uh, it's incredibly difficult is
Who
the reality.
sponsored your visa? Did you have to sponsor your own as Rebag?
Yeah, I didn't do that. So actually, our investors sponsored my first visa. So in
Mm,
the order of things, first, and that's a good trick if people listen, as
yeah.
part of the MBA, or really, any sort of graduate school or college in the US, on your student visa, there's usually a 1 year what they call OPT, which is basically a free extra year. So that's super valuable for entrepreneurs. And if you're in science, it's STEM, you have like a 3 year. So that is incredible, right? If you are on a science master's in the US and you get 3 years, it's a huge difference between 1 year and 3 year. Because in 1 year, it means you need to start a company and figure out your next visa pretty much at the same time. If you have 3 year, you can do a lot of ideation and trials, etc. So I kind of did that, and then there's a few like letters that we can go through. But yeah, I had like what's called an investor visa at the beginning, and then I've never had H-1Bs, which is the employee visa,
Yeah, it's
but
the one I
that's
have. Yeah.
yeah. But many as a CEO of your company, you can actually be employed as an H-1B.
Yeah.
That's one thing you can do, and then eventually I got more like green card path, which I'm on now. But obviously, all of these have bigger hurdles, so.
Totally. And
I've
it
had all
takes
sorts,
time.
yeah, all sorts of statuses.
Yeah, so the bar is so much high for foreigners starting companies. I think the stat is like 55% or so of the billion-dollar startups in America were started by foreigners. Do you think that there's a correlation there? Do you think like, these people are so challenged and they have to make it work?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And honestly, there's also probably a range, right? But definitely, if you want to make it here, you definitely went through some hurdles. At the very minimum, administrative hurdles, and for some other people, also, life hurdles and all sorts of situations, which on my end, I was lucky. I didn't really have to deal with too much of that, but obviously that adds. On my end, it was more administrative because you're dealing with the time clock. It's like not only you have to create a company, but you are time bound and your company needs to be progressed enough that it can sustain your own immigration status, unless you play this one card, right, where then you don't need anything, and then you get married to an American person.
Yeah, that's the move. That's the move. Yeah.
It's incredible. Like I joke with a lawyer one day, and it's like, okay, I can tell you this, that, but the one thing is you get married, and then that solves everything.
You know that people sell their marriages, right? Like for 20K, 10K, whatever.
So
It's
I've
it's
I've I've, I've heard that
it's
before.
crazy.
So
It's
thank God
crazy.
I didn't have to do that. But yeah, just FYI, I know people who had to anticipate civil
Sure.
marriages to facilitate status for
Yeah.
sure.
Charles, going back to the ideation phase, and maybe you can tell us a little bit about your history with FJ and discuss a little bit the studio model, because that's another decision a bunch of entrepreneurs in the earlier stage of their careers are thinking, maybe have an offer from this studio model, and there's a wide variety of different studios and different terms, etc. But well, what's your take around studio models? Maybe you can talk about your experience at FJ, and what do you like, or maybe what do you like less about them?
Mm-hmm. No, to me, yeah, for sure. I gave a lot of thought to that. And by the way, remember, all of this was 10 years ago now, which sounds so. I think when I did that, none of this was remotely as organized as what you see now, right? So it was kind of like in flux or in debate. So for those who listen to us, yeah, eventually I started a company with FJ Labs, which is, mostly Fabrice Grinda and Jose Marin, two, worldwide marketplace entrepreneurs. And so I met Fabrice through basically business school. Actually, one teacher of mine made an intro. Basically, this is how little I knew about the internet, right? Or market. Like I didn't know Fabrice. I've never heard about Fabrice until I was on campus, right? So I made that intro, from my business school teacher, and then I talked to his team, etc. And so the idea, it came very quickly because that's also how Fabrice operates, right? At the end of the day, the way the studio works is a lot about relationship, just like every company in the world, right? And so to your point earlier, the main difference, I think, is because I'm a generalist. I think and I'm a first-time entrepreneur. You also have to recognize you're missing, right? And for me, when I started, it's definitely not a technologist, limited background. Also, did not have a co-founder at the time, right? Although I was doing all these meetups and meet your CTO and all that stuff, and it didn't clean. So for me, it made a lot of sense because it was very much like de-risking the project, and he was like, listen, these guys, they do this all the time. They have this track record. What am I gonna do on my own? I've never even been in a company, right? That's the reality. I've been in a bank, I've been in private equity firm. I've never really been in a company. So why am I going to build a company? So you have to realize that. And so then there's a discussion, obviously, on economics, etc., which these things have evolved. And you have to think about what does the studio, right, or the team brings to you. And to me, what Fabrice and Jose done, I'll do this over a million times. I've had like a million times the value of what they gave me. Because they're like, when I have a question, they have an answer. So that's pretty valuable,
Yeah,
right? I'm like, for
yeah,
Fabrice,
especially at the
I'm thinking,
beginning. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. And it's very true that obviously the value is disproportionately in the early stages because after, 1 or 2 years, you raise additional capital, you have a bigger team. They're still there, obviously, in a strategic way. But Fabrice Grinda, who's the guy who made multi-$100 million exits, made the first mock-ups of Rebag. He was our first product manager of sorts. Like we were spending hours and hours reviewing mock-ups. Like how valuable is that?
That's crazy. Charles, and now that we're on the Rebag topic again, one thing that I'm curious about is you guys own the inventory, correct? maybe let's take a step back and tell us more about the process of Rebag and maybe the way of doing that is just walking us through the consumer point of view end to end. What happens? What should I do? What should I expect? And then we'll delve into more questions.
Yeah, absolutely. So Rebag is fairly specific. Obviously, listeners may be familiar with many resale platforms, things like, Poshmark, RealReal, obviously eBay, etc. So we're fairly specific in two ways. One is we're ultra high end, right? So we're really in the world of accessories, mostly handbags, jewelry, watches. You're talking multi-$100 product, most of the time multi-$1,000 product, and often multi-tens of thousands of dollar product. So think extreme end of the spectrum. And because of that, we're able to run a very specific model that you can call a managed marketplace or end-to-end marketplace, where basically the seller, we do all the work essentially, right? So including buying the product. So the seller makes a quote. We have now a bunch of like super cool valuation software that we can talk about. And if you like the quote, you basically send us the product. We audit it for a couple of days at the warehouse, and then we pay, right? And if you go to our stores, because we do have stores, we even do that on the spot, and then we own the product.
And that's the first question I wanted to ask, because the RealReal and most of the other kind of similar companies for secondhand fashion clothing and items, they run a consignment model. So like you take the item, if you sell it, fine, you'll get a commission. If you don't sell it, then tough luck.
Yep.
Like, why going against that kind of current and then taking the inventory?
Yeah, so the main reason there is because in the market that we're in, because we're on the ultra high end side of the spectrum, it turns out that the constraint in this market is not demand, right? It's not selling. It's very easy for us to sell a Chanel bag that's like new at a good discount. The problem is, how do we acquire it, right? And so this is and our simple idea, right, was really that if you remove the friction on the seller side, if you make it easier for the seller, then you acquire the preferred high quality supply that currently doesn't move through alternative, constructs. And so that was, I didn't wake up a day and say, oh, it would be great if we buy product, right? It was kind of a thought process where I was seeing all this value in closets, and I was doing and asking people, like, you have like those 20 items there. Like, do you know of eBay? Like, I'm sure you know what a consignment store is, right? And they're like, why don't you do it? And at the end of the day, someone told me, listen, Charles, like, this is too much for me. I don't have the time. Like, listen, take whatever you want, do your thing, give me a check. And I'm like, that's it. This is what it is.
So to you, that was the best way to unlocking supply.
It's
to you, that was
that.
the main thing. Yeah.
And just to be clear, it's the way to unlock supply is you could summarize it as removing friction, but
sure.
a big part of removing friction is
it's
that
just show me the money.
median liquidity. Exactly.
Yeah. Interesting. Understood. And the other kind of question I had, especially with your experience at Rent the Runway, I was listening to an interview the other day, one of the founders, and she was talking about the vision of the experience economy as opposed to kind of owning the items. And you started in Rent the Runway in a way, and that kind of inspired you. Why did you go the ownership route as opposed to the experience/renting route?
That's a great question. I really love the rental model. I think it's a very valid trend, and there's a huge consumer need for that. The main issue with that, and you kind of see it today, right, with Rent the Runway, is really unit economics and just operations/financing of the model, right? Because if you think about it, especially how they do it I'm sure there's a million of people who want to pay $100 a month and get the huge value. But the problem is even when I was there, it was like 8 years ago, right? They had the biggest dry cleaner in America. So imagine now, right?
That is wild.
It's incredible. They had 30 seamstresses, right? So there's so much work, and the problem is, even if $100 subscription, is obviously not cheap, but given all the costs that are involved, I always tell it was very difficult. And so that's kind of how I iterated, and I thought, if you want to make the unit economics work, it's probably more on the higher end side of things. But to be honest, we have looked into equivalent, right? You could say, and I think it's still like in the cards somehow. We have a program we call Infinity, where essentially people who buy from us can exchange their item back at a guaranteed price. So that's kind of a proxy for
For
this
another item or for money?
for credits, basically for store credits. So if you buy anything from us, I think within 3 months we give you back 80 cents, 80% in the form of credits, and it's 60 cents in 12 months in credits, right? So it's kind of the idea, right, of the how do we generate that circularity, not necessarily with rental, but it's always something we look into, and it's not impossible that we get into that. It's just they're very big operational and financial issues as well, in particular in working capital.
Charles, now that we're in this topic of unit economics, I want to address sort of the elephant in the room, right? I think the market cap of Rent the Runway is whatever, $100 million or so, something tiny. You look at the graph of the Real, which is another similar company. They lost 95% or something of their value since IPO. And the key thing here is that, to your point, economics do not work, and these guys are still losing money. So, how can you, when looking at those comps that could be you in the future, how can you avoid that path, and how can you differentiate and maybe even learn from maybe their mistakes or misinterpretations that these guys did?
Yeah, I mean, you're spot on. I guess there's a couple of things there. One is, generally there's current market moves, et cetera, that, the market has been pretty dire, obviously, over the last year because of all these macro trends. So there's been a general, revaluation of all things, in particular, given rate increase, undesirability of any business model that burns cash in perpetuity, which, by the way, should make good sense. Right. And so to me, that's kind of healthy in a way. Now, okay, 100 million, maybe that's a little bit brutal, but fundamentally, you're correct, right? This is not a surprise, because if you discuss with Fabrice, etc., like, this is very clear to us that these businesses, I don't know that they have in the current way ever profitable unit economics. Right, for a very simple reason, which we discussed, right, is like, even think about it on other real, they take so many things, right? They take those 30 categories. Like at some point, they even took furniture or whatever. But
yeah,
they
I think
they
now they're
sometimes
closing a bunch of their unprofitable categories.
yeah, but like how is that? How do you need 12 years to I read the
Yeah,
minutes
yeah,
from their recent call, right, and it
same.
basically says, oh, like we're stopping anything under like $50. I'm like, why did you
So
have that
I
in the
guess
first
maybe
place?
the tension, just to play devil's advocate, what they were probably trying to do is increase recurrence and saying, okay, now we're in their house. What else can we
Yep.
sell these guys to? And so from that perspective, it makes sense. But from the other point of view, if you're getting into a category that will never make money, maybe you're subsidizing the more profitable categories. But yeah, so to you, it's just a matter of focus on economics and profitable categories that will differentiate
It's a matter of
you.
balance, because I think your point is very valid as well. And we had in a way the opposite problem, right? Which is
Yeah,
we started with one category, right?
hyper focused. Yeah.
We started with bags, and we did that for like 6 years. We did just bags and accessories, right? So we had the opposite thing, ultra focus, which I think was well suited. But at some point, we also had the same question. We have low recurrence, right? Just because people are not buying a $2,000 bag every second, right? So like, if we see you once a year or twice a year, we're already very happy, right? So that's kind of our prime. And so it's a matter of balance, right? So we've been for sure going on the other route, which is adding categories, but we try to add categories that share similar specificities, right? Sort of high AOV, high desirability, high liquidity, and all of them have like some minimum bar, right? You're not really going to see on the side anything lower than like $300, etc. Because even on $300 item, to be honest, we don't really make much, right? We take it for, you could think about it as service to customers, right? So and that's the tension, right? Is the real model or others? It's great because it's a lot of service, right? Like they come to your house, like it's super great, right? But then they have 1,000 people, right, that drive cars that go to people's closets, right? There's like 100 million payroll just on that, right? So that's a problem. And so the challenge has always been, you go for single source, which I think is what they're trying to do, right? It's to your point. I'm in your closet, I'm gonna grab as much as I can. But if I grab 20 things and then I go to the warehouse and then 10 of them, they're like whatever, $50, $100, and then I have to return them, and then I have to store them somewhere, right? And then someone still has to take the pictures of them. And so you're like, probably there's a middle ground somewhere where you're trying to maximize lifetime value, but also you're not onboarding negative unit economics items.
Yeah. I mean, we could take this conversation to many different routes, but before I forget, I want to talk about what I think is sort of the crux of the matter in this sort of models. And the real had a ton of issues with this is the authentication process. And I know this is a sensitive topic because you don't want to give away any secret sauce, but without giving away anything, can you walk us through like, how does it happen? I give you a $5,000 Chanel bag or whatever. What's the process? How do you decide this is the real thing versus this is a fake? And again, without giving away any sensitive information.
No, but it's okay. But the reality, there's sort of two dimensions to this. And so over the years, first of all, this is a huge topic, right? So one of the reasons why we ran the managed marketplace model or sort of the full inventory model is exactly for that reason, right? Because someone who's paying multi-$1,000s, they need to know that they need some sort of guarantee that this is accurate, this is truthful, etc., which makes good sense. And that's exactly the difference between a specialized marketplace, kind of like we are, and something more generalist, right? Like maybe an eBay, etc. Although you will see now that eBay is building a lot of these more like managed features for that exact purpose, right? But authentication is one of them. And so historically, when you send us something, basically it has to go through the hands of experts, right? To this day, this is still the number one route, right? And
this is a human being inspecting the object.
Exactly, it's exactly that. Obviously, it's a bit more evolved. We've consolidated the knowledge, etc. There are a few technologies out there that try to address this need, but to this point, it's still, and that's one of the problems. It's still largely a human decision. And this talent is extremely rare, right? So what we had to do over the years is obviously we had to recruit external authenticators, but there's not enough people.
Who are these people? Like what does it mean to be an authenticator? What did they do before?
Honestly, it's like if you're on a career that you're never gonna need a job ever and have fully employed, be an authenticator, right?
Don't code, just authenticate bags.
Probably code is a good one. But, yeah, authentication is like it's 1 to 10 in terms of supply and demand, right? So, and the problem is because there is no training. There is no school where you learn these things. Like you can go to the history of art, right? That's a class, and then maybe you can work at Sotheby's, etc., or in a museum. You can go to a history of fashion. You cannot yet go to an authenticator track, and I think eventually that will be one. And so you have to find people from different profiles, right? Which obviously people who've had that experience before is one of them, but most of the time they don't. So you find people who have product knowledge, right, is where we start. People who are really experts. And the reality, the way you learn the product is like everything in life is by exposing yourself to the product and being absolutely passionate about, every time there's a new season, you go to the store, you go online, you watch all the forums and you micro zoom on everything and you take notes of, oh, this is new, this is not, and eventually you build this like mental database. The whole work that we had to do is how do you document that? Right? How do you make someone who has a lot of internal knowledge and make it more into a repeatable framework? And so we had to, document these and training these. And so now we do have, training ways and we can teach people authentication who have the right passion and also the right skills, which largely has to do with, observation, minutia, and focus.
That's very interesting. And there's also a big automation and data play here, right? Maybe you can tell us a bit more about Clear and that whole initiative, valuation initiative as well.
Yeah, so Claire is a huge deal. It's Claire is our essentially pricing and recognition AI, and so what it does, it
Just
basically
quick
is
clarification. Clear assumes everything is so clear is just valuation, or it assumes it also identifies if it's fake or not.
no. So Claire is not an authentication tool
Got it.
at this point.
Understood. So assumes once we understand this is the real thing, then what's it worth?
It's exactly that. So and actually
Mm,
it's reversed. Claire is able to recognize an item based on one image. It's able to tell you what the item is, and it's able to tell you what Rebag wants to pay. Now,
that's crazy.
all of that assumes that the item is authentic. Now, then you will send it to us, and it will go through our sort of expert protocol to validate that.
Got it. Understood. So before leaving the authentication conversation, just give us some tips for the next time we're thrifting or buying secondhand bags or something. What are some kind of counterfeit identification 101 tips you can give? Like what should we look for?
Yeah, I can give you a thing, but this is the most funny thing is I can never be an authenticator. Most
So
and this
if I'm with you and you would just buy a Louis
that's the
Vuitton from
thing.
the street.
Do not no, definitely not. That I can tell you is fake. But like, do you see? It's like sometimes they show me things and I just do not see.
Yeah.
You see, so they're
Yeah.
saying so. Obviously, I can tell you the things we look at, right? Like we look at, the stitching, right? Obviously, some of these items have like serial codes, so there's a lot of literature about this. In Louis Vuitton, in particular, there are specific date codes that you can research. You can put that, query, and it's very easily findable on the internet. Or we have good resources at Rebag, and at least you can check that the code, for instance, is a legitimate code, right? But that's kind of like the very much this baseline, right? It's not going to tell you that it's true. It's going to tell you if it's a bad fake, right? Then there's things like stitching. There's things like order, which is always a fun one. The order, like, does it feel this plastic order, right? So you don't want to smell like almost like oil kind of thing. You don't want to smell that, right?
So hard
So
to automate. Yeah.
that's the thing. That's the problem, right? That's why to this day there's not yet great technology. There's some that use like microscopes, etc. But eventually, and we can talk about it, it will be sold through like blockchain and I think other ways. But that's why it's very difficult to build a vision-driven AI tool because you're talking about incredible minute. You're talking about a micro zoom stitching, that's like maybe 1 millimeter to the left instead of being 1 millimeter to the right.
Do you think that's the next step, Charles? Using NFTs to kind of authenticate bags and high value items?
Yeah, it has to be, right? So I'm definitely not an expert in blockchain and NFT, but I've been looking into it obviously over the past couple of years. It's very clear that this is one of the best use case of the blockchain, right? Because what you want to see is you want to see something that is permanent, right? That is tagged in some sort of an irreversible way, right? And so, writing things in a ledger, for instance, and like transferring, certificates, these are all things that are very, very much applicable. And there are actually a lot of technologies now. I mean, even LVMH has started like its own blockchain that's called Aura, and it's trying to make like some sort of like industry-wide consortium. Like at the end of the day, how this has to be solved, it has to be solved at the source, where manufacturers, in particular
Exactly.
luxury, yeah, you can insert a chip or a plug or some kind of NFC, and it's in the product, which makes it difficult to extract, if you
I
will.
think
Or
it makes total sense. And I'm surprised most of the NFT push that I've seen from high-end brands were mostly on the, we're doing an NFT drop for this exclusive piece or these, very limited edition thing, more like a PR or
yep.
engagement approach more than on this kind of solution for counterfeit, which is a huge issue these guys have.
Yeah, no, and there is really in particular this Aura blockchain. It's already up there. Like for instance, Louis Vuitton has started to integrate NFTs in some of their most recent series, right? And there's a sort of companion app, if you will, that they can scan at the stores, and it tells you if it's true, not true. The problem is that in order to fix that at the store, the resale product is is the historical product. So everything you and me or anyone has in their closet was made obviously in the last years or decades. So it is not tagged. So imagine
Yeah.
it's good. The prime is going to take maybe 10,
It's gonna
15, 20
yeah, that makes
years
sense. That makes sense.
to, but eventually it will be fixed. But
Yeah, you can't
somehow it,
solve the problem for the items that are already in the street. Maybe going
exactly.
forward. Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. And
If
where
you
does that
compound that over decades, eventually most of the product gets tagged and problem solved.
yeah, that's a fair point. And where does that leave you guys? Because if one of the things that would enable them to do, if they have NFTs for their own things, is to have potentially their own resale marketplace, right? Um, so how do you see Rebag interacting in that world? Let's think that that happens in a couple of years.
Oh yeah, and that's I think that's completely where it's going, right? So eventually, and that was the whole thesis since the beginning, right? Is that eventually these worlds would merge, right? Because first-hand luxury, second-hand luxury, it's all just of a customer journey. It's one day I buy first-hand, one day I buy second-hand, and if you can make these work together, then you get the customer into that cycle. Like I always say, like imagine all the Rebag customers, they're sort of the next generation, right? People who buy from us, they're the next generation of luxury users. So there is a value for brands to get in that business. And likewise, on the sale side, these tend to be more premium customers and we give them liquidity. What do you think they do with the liquidity? They go and buy the new seasons, they reinvest, right? So if you can figure that out, it all becomes this like loop. And so eventually I expect, all the brands or groups or retailers to get in that business somehow. I think, and it's starting to happen. The prime is one, things are very slow, right, in that world, right? So things take time. And also two is all the unit economics and operational issue that we discussed, they're also going to have that, right? And so that's the prime. And so I think this is where the opportunity is for a company like ours at Rebag is that there's not really going to be a shortcut to rebuilding everything we built, right? Like it's almost 8 years. It's 100 million plus of investments. It's great people. It's great technology. It's authenticators. So there's not really going to be a shortcut to that. So we think eventually we can enable that, right? Is where we're trying to go. We can power resale on the luxury side of things for brands, for retailers, for other marketplaces, for auction houses, for anyone who, because we can make it plug and play in something that's incredibly difficult to start from scratch.
Yeah, and going back to your original boss, I think the original idea of Rent the Runway was to do this as a service, a white label solution, and I forget who did they pitch this to, but they didn't agree. But I totally agree. This should be where the things go in the next couple of years. What's your relationship today with the brands, Charles? And I'm sure you're gonna say great, but I'm sure there's also some contention.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, yeah, we don't have any prem. The reality is we do not have relationships with brands. Is the short version. Like we have conversations with brands. Obviously we talk to them all the time, most of them. But to this day, we are completely independent from the brands, right? And so, but that's exactly what we'd like to change. And the funny thing is, we're having this conversation in 2022. I had the same podcast 7 years ago, right? And things haven't really progressed that much. It's just the reality, right? Like now, that's not completely true. The only thing that changed between now and when we got started, I would say that in the first 2, 3, 4 years, I had to convince those discussions a lot of these executives that resale mattered.
For sure, yeah. That's why I said at the beginning, the circular economy is super trendy these days.
Yes. So that is the main difference. Like today, things like sustainability are much more
Yeah.
top of mind. All of this is now obvious. The resale market in general with us and many, many other companies is much, much, much bigger than it used to be in the US and in the world. So I think it's like check, check, check. Everyone understands for many reasons it has to be. I think now the questions have shifted more to the how, right? And that kind of like was your question is like, first of all, there is that issue that most resale businesses are like unprofitable or negative unit economics. So, that's not really appealing to anyone who wants to get into this business, right? It's like, yeah, I want to do resale as a brand, but I'm clearly seeing there's some complexities there. So that's a big hurdle in terms of investments and decision making. And so there's all these discussion, should I use a partner? Should I start my own thing? And frankly, you've seen all of it. There's been acquisitions, there's been partnerships, there's been a couple companies trying to do their own thing. There's been white label solutions, and so there's a bit of trial and error. My perception is that the more you go into the luxury side of things, the more you're going to want to have control, right? Because of the demands of the customer, right? And I think that's why also these companies will take more time than others, because they're obviously very nervous about, anytime you're going to touch the customer, interact with the customer, things have a high bar. So it's not a surprise to me that most of what you see now in terms of partnerships or third-party resale, they're more on the entry-level side of things, right? Because this is a bit more of a flow business.
We're looking at the whole circular economy landscape, and this is more the investor in me asking the question. There's a lot of different propositions, and looking at it from the inside, what do you think is closer to, because to your point before, right? We've been discussing this for 10 years, and sometimes there's two ways of investing: early or way too early. And so I'm sure within the landscape of the circular economy, there are things that might happen, but at a later stage, not really. What do you think is ripe for, starting to really grow within the circular economy today?
Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting. To be honest, they're still on rental, for instance, right? That's one that has not been cracked, to my knowledge, anywhere, right? So, for instance, I can tell you the ideas that I've been hearing for the last decade almost, and that, in my opinion, have to this day 100% failure everywhere in the world. That idea of a peer-to-peer rental, right? At least for fashion. Every year I talk to 10 people who, have, and which is a beautiful idea, right? Which is, I have my closet and you have, it's like this decentralized, peer-to-peer sharing. But then you look into the unit economics and the reality, and it's like, how is that going to work, right? Because I own my thing. You're gonna rent it what for like $50? I'm gonna take 10, and I have to like dry clean it, etc. And so this is, for instance, an idea that you want to work because it's beautiful, and it has hurt itself on the realities of unit economics and scaling. Even things like, I would extend that even to rental in general, right? It's like one-off rentals have pretty much failed consistently, right? So that idea, and then this one in particular, Rent the Runway, has moved to more like subscription, like membership-based rental, right? So that to me is a big trend that you're seeing, because otherwise, again, with all the friction costs and the customer marketing, etc., if it's like, hey, whatever, rent a tuxedo for a wedding kind of thing, this is very much of a one-off. It's very difficult to make it work, versus more, I think, where most of the rental models, they've moved from one-off to you could exactly like permanent or semi-permanent, and I think that's where maybe the unit economics meets the dream, right? Because obviously you can amortize the customer, you have more LTV, etc. So something that I would look into, if you're investors or entrepreneur out there, I would be worried about purely one-off rental situations, and if you're looking at that more like some sort of recurring stream, or that, I think that helps a lot.
Charles, what's the deal with fashion as an investment? Because that was also kind of news to me. Is that a thing? And when I
No,
mean
it's a tough
fashion as an
question.
investment is, yeah, it's like I'm buying a bag and it appreciates in value,
Oh, I see
buying a
what you're
used
saying.
bag. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
no,
Not
so
fashion as
this
an investment in VC, as more of
got
personal
it, got
investment.
it.
Yeah, yeah.
No, so this is very mature, and to be honest, that's the core insight, right, of Rebag. Is this is very true. Historically, actually, there's a lot of good statistics on this. Like if you bought like especially Birkin handbags, a decade ago, like you would have beat the S&P, for instance. Right? It's pretty crazy, and it works largely for some Chanel handbags. So this is absolutely true. I give you a stat. When we started the company maybe 7 years ago, the price of Chanel bags new versus now is 2x. right? So there's items that we were buying in stores in 2014, 15 in the US, 5,000 bucks, and now it's probably $9,000 or $10,000, right? So frankly, sometimes I think we should never have sold it, right? Because we were buying these things, maybe $3,000 back in the days. We could have made, a 300% markup, so, but the difference is this obviously on the appreciating assets in fashion or in luxury is still minimal, right? It's still very much constrained to, the Birkins, Hermes Birkins, Kelly's, Chanel. But what we've been doing at Rebag is because of our valuation knowledge in our tool, like we actually publish a lot of literature about this. Like we have something we call the Claire report, where basically we
I
publish
saw it.
those.
You didn't publish the 2022 yet, right?
Yeah, we just did actually. Maybe like
Oh, so maybe
yeah.
give us a what's the latest? Like if for people trying to buy holidays are coming, Christmas, what are the new, or is it always stable? Like the same brands are typically the best performing ones.
Yeah, so that's the thing. There's always the usual suspects, right? So this is no news to anyone. Hermes, Birkins, and Kelly's. The higher end of the Chanel bags, the limited edition Louis Vuitton. All of that is like core product. It retains value, often appreciates. So that there's not too much news there. What's interesting and what we're trying to educate people on is that this you could call it investor mindset, as you described. It actually can happen on other products that maybe people don't know about. For instance, all of the sort of limited editions, streetwear, right? Like that's not a surprise. I mean, in sneakers, people, you buy retail, there's a shortcut of shortness of supply. And so everybody knows that, right? But it also translates in fashion, a lot of the Supreme collaborations, for instance. There's been Supreme XLV, right? So if anything you can put there that usually has a pretty big premium.
Yeah, and
And
then
one
you start getting into the collection side and the collectionist.
It's exactly that. And typically, there's one brand that we showcase in the report that's called Telfar, right? It's an American brand, $200 to $300 retail price, but they did a great job at creating scarcity, at creating desirability, and they resell for maybe $500 or $600, right? So what's interesting in that, you see this investor mindset. It can be translated in a way at any price point, but just if you're smart about it. It's like everything. If you do your research, you're going to pick up those things. If you query the Claire tool, we actually show you the value retention there.
Yeah.
So you can query, you can learn that.
That's great. We should use more the Claire tool, everybody. So if you buy just an entry level product or whatever, then that probably depreciates. So it's not a matter of anything that's remotely good.
Yeah, so it varies very much by brand, etc. And so we actually put this chart where we show you, but the typical asset in fashion does depreciate, right? So we actually publish in that report the percentage of average retention from brands, and so appreciating is the exception, right? Not the norm. And this is where it goes into becoming savvy and knowing what you're doing, and that's how you create arbitrage.
Charles, can't thank you enough for this time. Just want to give you 2-3 minutes. The floor is yours for any closing remarks. Where can people find more about you, about Rebag? Something we didn't discuss, I wish we had, is your brick and mortar presence as well. So maybe you can give some locations that you got that people can actually go and visit you in person.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're obviously digital on rebag.com on the app. We do have our 10 stores in New York City, in Miami, in LA, in Greenwich, Connecticut. So you can see us there. But on retail, it's a very big topic, particularly now for all sort of DTC businesses or even digital marketplaces. Everybody knows for the past year or so, since the new iOS changes, it's been very difficult to acquire a customer online. It's getting more and more expensive. And so getting into retail or directly or through wholesale, that's been usually a good source of growth. Obviously,
Is it
also
mostly
comes.
branding, in your opinion?
No, so
The user brick and mortar.
yeah, you can do it in different ways, right? Like if you can certainly have one or two showrooms, and that's certainly a good like activation, but that obviously is not a scalable channel. We've been trying to make retail a scalable channel. and it has its own challenges, and I don't think we really cracked it yet. One of the reasons retail works for us or is beneficial is because we have a very high-end product. So, when you want to look at a $10,000 Birkin, there is a value in looking at it in person. The reality is luxury is still largely underpenetrated versus the typical e-commerce penetration. It's only maybe 15% digital versus other categories. So it's still on the lower end side of things just because of the nature of the product, and people want a luxury experience.
That didn't change with COVID because there was a
it did.
big acceleration. It
Yeah, it's a
improved.
huge deal. Back in the days when we started, it was sub 10%. So it was maybe 8% digital. And through COVID, it went to 20%, I think, the year of COVID. And now it's kind of like just around that. But you're spot on. The 20% goal was supposed to be a
Yeah, it accelerated a
2025.
few years.
Yeah, and definitely that goal was met early on, but still on a relative basis, it's underpenetrated to most other digital categories. And it still means 80% plus of the luxury market is offline, right?
And
So
it serves as a drop-off location as well, right? For the supply side.
yes. So that's actually why it's super valuable for us, because we actually it's a two-way street. So it's actually a marketplace as well, right? So you can be a buyer and buy product. You can be a seller and sell product. We have what we call the Rebag bar, where in an hour, we can review the product, we can evaluate it, we can authenticate it, and we can pay. And so that's, we were told, I guess we're closing the loop there. That's sort of the ultimate immediacy, right? Because, no appointment, you get your liquidity essentially within the hour, right? And so that's
awesome.
one of the ways that we've been getting a good supply.
Great. So we'll include all of this information on the show notes as well. Thank you so much again, Charles.
Super. It was amazing.